Hey Defenders, welcome back. In this video, I want to focus on Wazuh's vulnerability detection that we can enable that will allow us to detect vulnerable applications, software, and services that are running on our Wazuh agents. So stick around and we'll jump into it. Alright, so Wazuh gives us the ability to also run a vulnerability detector, right? And so what this does and how this works from a kind of high level standpoint on the back end is the Wazuh agent is able to collect applications and packages and their versions that are installed on the server. So the agent collects all these up and sends them to the manager, where the manager is able to download feeds from various threat feeds. And by default, these are the feeds that Wazuh incorporates, right? So we can pull feeds from all of these global vulnerability databases, right? And for their publicly announced CVEs, we can compare applications that the agent provides to the manager and their versions. We can compare them against our vulnerability database and see, okay, is this version, X, Y, and Z vulnerable? And if it is, what are these steps to resolve that? And so that's all something that we can answer with our Wazuh architecture that we actually already have in place. We just need to make a few config settings, right? So as you can see, this list here is by default. So you could add your own list if you want. If you find some commercial vulnerability database that you want to pay for, that maybe they're more up to date or they do more proactive collection, you can certainly enable your own feeds. In this example, we're just going to use the ones that they already have provided. And so you can see we have feeds for various operating systems, right? So we have Ubuntu, Red Hat, and CentOS, Debian. We're also the MVD, which is the National Vulnerability Database. We're getting feeds from that. And then also feeds for Microsoft products as well. So just out of the box, we have a lot of global vulnerability databases already pre-configured for us. And so let's go ahead and jump into it. So I needed a vulnerable box, and to do that, there's a site called VulnHub, which is pretty cool. It provides a lot of OVAs that you can pop into, ESX, VMware, VirtualBox, whatever VM management tool you're using. And there's one called Typhoon, which is just a really vulnerable Ubuntu box that they have. So, and as you can see here, they have a little description on it where they state that it contains several vulnerabilities and configuration errors. And the purpose of this box is to test your skills, right? So there's kind of some capture the flag stuff you can do in here. So it emulates virtual services and applications that if you're looking to practice your penetration testing skills, you can spin one of these guys up on a local network and have at it. But I figured this would also be a good box for us to install a Wazuh agent on and enable the vulnerability detection to see what all it picked up. So I have actually done that already. So I logged into the Typhoon box. So this is what you see on the screen here. You can see it's also running a very old version of Ubuntu, 14.04. It's very old, and you can see they're already kind of calling for an upgrade. But since this is such a vulnerable box, I figured let's go ahead and see what Wazuh picks up out of the box for us. So I've already installed the Wazuh agent already on this box. So if I go into our OSEC, etc, and osec.conf, so what we need to make sure, and what is enabled by default on the agent side, so what we shouldn't need to do is make sure that the syscollector WUDL is not disabled. Right, so disabled is set to no, so we know it is enabled. And what we also want to make sure is that the packages flag here is set to yes, and that the operating system is also set to yes. So this will allow the Wazuh agent that's running on this server to detect the operating system, right? And to also grab packages of applications that are installed on it, right? So we wanted to make sure that the Wazuh agent can provide, you know, hey, MySQL or PHP admin version XYZ is installed, and send that to our manager. So these are the two, the OS and the packages blocks are the two that you, under the syscollector WOODLE, are the ones you want to make sure are set to yes, and as well as disabled is set to no. This is all by default though, so unless you've changed it after the fact, after an install, then you shouldn't have to worry about doing that. So that's good. If you didn't make any changes, once you save out the file, just make sure you do a restart. You can just do that with service, Wazuh-agent restart. All right, and while that's restarting, let's go ahead and jump on the manager side. So from the manager side, I'll just go in through the web UI here, and let's go into configuration, and let's go into edit configuration. And if we scroll down, we will eventually find our vulnerability detector tags, right? So you can see what I'm highlighted over here. And by default, this is actually not enabled. So enabled is set to no. So right off the bat, we need to change that to yes. The interval time will allow us to tell the manager how often we want this to run. I have this set to 1 minute just for our lab purposes, so I'll get results back quickly. But you know, in a production environment, to maybe save some CPU and memory on your Wazuh managers, you could space this out a little better, right? So maybe I would say once per day, or maybe in 7 days I want this to run, and you would just do that by a D, an S for seconds, an H for hour. But here we could say 7 days if you wanted to run this, say once a week, right? So we can go ahead and leave it back to a minute. And the ignore time is a parameter that you can set to where time during which intervals that have already been alerted will be ignored. So if the manager has already detected this vulnerable, you know, version within the last 6 hours or whatever interval you want to set it to, it won't create a new alert for that, right? So that's that can be beneficial as well. So you're not just spamming the so you're not constantly spamming the same, you know, vulnerable version of an application, right? If it's taking you a week or whatever the case may be to upgrade that version, you can set the ignore time to where it won't just keep alerting you on that, right? And so that's a setting we can set. And then run on start. So this would be the start of the Wazuh manager once it restarts, right? And so we'll go ahead and keep that at yes. And now we get into our vulnerability feeds, right? So we have a tag here for the Ubuntu OS vulnerabilities. The name, provider name is set to canonical, right? So if we compare that to what we see within their default URLs, right? That's what's being used for Ubuntu distributions, right? So that's our vulnerability database that we're grabbing that correlates to Ubuntu operating system vulnerabilities, right? And so we have that set to enabled. And Ubuntu also has some different operating system names corresponding with it, right? Like there's Trusty, Xennial, Bionic, Focal. And then we get into our Debian block, right? And so we see the two operating systems for Debian, right? And that's also enabled. And this update interval here corresponds to how often the Wazuh manager will reach out to our vulnerability feeds, right? This guy here, and download the latest databases, right? So these are constantly changing as new CVEs are discovered and created and introduced to the public. So you can set an update interval to reflect that. 1 minute is just what I have. Again, just for demo purposes, 1 minute is overkill. You could set this probably to like once a day or once a week. Probably once a day is what I would recommend. You know, it's just quickly reaching out to these feeds and grabbing the latest vulnerability databases. So that's good. And then you see Red Hat as well, that's also enabled. And then we have the different versions of Red Hat. So 5, 6, 7, and 8. Again, our update interval. And then we have the same for the Windows. And then for the National Vulnerability Database as well. So this is how we control what feeds, vulnerability feeds, we want to bring in from the manager, right? And so we'll tell them, of course, you can probably leave all these enabled. Maybe if your environment is strictly, only Red Hat and you want to disable Ubuntu and Debians, you could do that if you wanted to, right? I mean, technically these feeds will take up disk space on your Wazuh managers, but I don't see any harm on downloading some of these other feeds. So I don't foresee any issues with that. But this is the block where we can control that, right? So the big thing, again, we want to make sure our vulnerability detector is set to enabled, and that's with this yes flag here. So I'll go ahead and save that. And then upon saving, I will restart. And then what should happen is our agent will disconnect because we're restarting. And then the manager, so the Wazuh agent will disconnect while the manager is restarting. Once it restarts, let's go ahead and kick that off. So you can see it's unable to connect, and it's now restarting as well. So now the agent is restarting. It's going to run that syscollector WUDL, which will grab the applications, services, and their versions, right, that are running on the agent and send them to our Wazuh manager, who our Wazuh manager will now compare that against the vulnerability feeds that it has collected, right? So let's go ahead and jump into that. And if we, out of the still under the configuration tab, we could select on the vulnerabilities, and we see our vulnerability detector status is set to enabled. So you can also, double check that that is set to enabled. And then we also see our providers. So here are the actual URLs to the vulnerability databases that we're grabbing from, right? So, and you can see this pertains to our providers that we were just checking out, and then the OS as well. So you see the Trusty, Xennial, Bionic. If we go into Red Hat, we'll see the Red Hat versions 5, 6, 7, and 8. I guess there's this J Red Hat we can enable if we wanted to by default, and then we have the National Vulnerability Database enabled by default as well. So that all looks good, and you can see the URLs that we're grabbing from, so that's good. And let's see, it's hopefully been about a minute. Let's jump into our dashboard and see the vulnerabilities that are flagged. So this should be under, if you go into modules, you should see the vulnerabilities dashboard here. If you don't, you could go into settings, modules, and if you scroll down to never mind, it's enabled by default, so you shouldn't have to do that, so that's fine. So we'll go into modules, vulnerabilities, and we'll just do the last 24 hours, and we see our feeds coming in, right? So let me go to my agent. So we see this Typhoon local, right? So we see the IP address of this guy, the host name, and all that. So our Wazuh agent is on here, and we're active, so that's good. If I go into inventory data, I can see a lot of stats around this server, right? So I have the interfaces that are up, if they're assigned an IP address or not. So we see some interfaces here that are up. Docker is also running on this, so we see some of that as well. We see ports that are listening for connections, so a ton of ports here. Again, this is a box that is supposed to be hacked, so they have a lot of stuff. It's got a lot of services listening, and so we can see the ports that they're listening on here. And then if we scroll down to the packages, we'll see the data that we're comparing against the vulnerability databases that are now on the Wazuh manager, right? So I see Python's on here, MySQL, MongoDB, some other Python packages. So here is what Windows Update. I don't want to take the time to do that. Just kidding, guys. Always update as often as possible. We see packages that are installed, and as you can see, there's a ton of them, right? And so what is totally happening is our Wazuh agent is able to enumerate all of our packages, so that's good. We know that the syscollector portion on the Wazuh agent is working, and now he's sending these packages along with their versions to the manager, who is then comparing it against our vulnerability database feeds that we have, right? So if we get out of here, so we know syscollector is working correctly, right? If you don't see your packages installed, then make sure that your syscollector is enabled and that the packages tag is set to yes as well. But that all looks good, so I'll go ahead and back up one, and let's go into vulnerabilities, and we'll load. So, okay, good. It looks like this is ran. So now we have a nice little dashboard displaying vulnerabilities that we've picked up, right? So this is great. We have them sorted as well. So there's a lot of criticals. So let's go ahead and select the criticals, and we can then quickly filter on that. And they have some dashboard and they have some visualizations here. So most common CVEs that have triggered, top affected packages. Okay, so it looks like Python is pretty dominant. So if I select Python, we see there's a few CVEs that correlate to this specific package, right? So what we can then do is then if we pop into events, we'll also then see all the metadata around this. And let's see, okay, so I see that this Python Samba package is vulnerable. I know the CVE. Now, what can I really do with this, right? So we get a ton of metadata around the CVE, CVSS scores that are set, some attack vector types, so how could someone potentially exploit this? And it looks like someone could exploit the Samba package running on here, right? So the package name was Python Samba, the package source was Samba, and here we get some more a more user-friendly description, right? So use after free vulnerability in Samba 4.x before 4.7.3 allows remote attackers to execute arbitrary code via a crafted SMB1 request. So that's not great. And that's, I guess, why they correspond it to network as the attack vector, because they don't have to be actually have it be logged in as a user on the box. They could craft a SMB1 network packet and send it to our vulnerable host here and get some remote execution, right? And so that's what it's detailing here. So in 4.x before 4.7.3, so we would know if we then look up the version of this Samba package, we see that it's version 4.3.11, right? So that fits the 4.x, but definitely also fits before version 4.7.3. So we would need to just upgrade this Samba version to a version later than to a version 4.7.3 or later, right? And we would know that that would then be resolved. So take a look at some other ones. So we only had focused on the Python Samba, and we have a plentiful amount of vulnerabilities on this box. Oh, TCP dump. Okay, that's kind of interesting. Let's see what's going on here. So if we scroll down, so we are running 4.5.1, and we can see the Juniper PPPoE ATM parser and TCP dump before 4.9 has a buffer overflow, right? So we get it's nice that they also provide a better description, right? That's a little more human friendly to read and is easier to understand. So we see why, why is this package vulnerable? Oh, okay, this is why it's vulnerable, because it has a buffer overflow in it. and we see that it relates to any TCP dump packages before 4.9. And well, you can see that we're running on 4.5. So we would need to upgrade our TCP dump to a version 4.9.0 or later, right? So, and this is a great way for us to quickly and easily see how what vulnerable software our servers are running, right? And we don't have to have a commercial vulnerability scanner like something like Rapid7 or Nessus, right? There are open source scanners such as OpenVAS, which we'll get into in later videos. It's also on the list. But this is a great tool for us to be able to quickly detect vulnerable applications that are running on our agent, right? You know, we don't have to deploy we don't have to deploy the architecture for a vulnerability scanner, such as something like Rapid7 or Nessus, right? We don't have to waste the hardware to stand up a scanner on the network and make sure firewall rules are applicable and make sure it has login credentials so it can do in-depth scanning. We can get this in-depth scanning with our already installed Wazuh infrastructure, right? Vulnerability scanners are still important. Yes, I'd still highly recommend them, and we'll get into those in future videos. But if your networks are in the very elementary stages of being built, and you just got Wazuh deployed throughout on your servers, we can take advantage of this vulnerability detector feature that's pre-bundled with Wazuh to be able to understand the vulnerable applications that are running on our servers, and we can always stay up to date on the latest version, right? So this is a great feature to add. Is pretty easy to implement, and I would highly recommend it for you guys. And again, in future videos we'll cover some open source vulnerability scanners such as OpenVAS. I really enjoy that one, so stay tuned for that. And I appreciate you guys hanging out with me in this video, and I will see you soon.